Lucas's 30th birthday party had been a buzzing topic in our quiet neighborhood for days. My wife, Emily, was practically glowing with excitement when the invitation arrived. It wasn't just her enthusiasm that caught my attention, it was the intensity of it. She talked about the party constantly, asked me for opinions on her outfit, a rare occurrence, and even started working out more fervently in the weeks leading up to it. Lucas has such a way of bringing people together, she gushed one evening as she packed the dress she'd picked out. It'll be nice to unwind a little. Her words were innocent, but something about her tone felt rehearsed. I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that her excitement went beyond the casual neighborhood camaraderie. Sure, Lucas was charming, a little too charming. He'd moved in next door about a year ago with his wife, Nora. But with Nora out of town visiting her family for a few weeks, this party had a different air about it. The evening of the party arrived. Emily looked stunning in a figure-hugging red dress that I barely remembered seeing her wear before. I threw on a blazer and slacks, half wondering if I should have picked something sharper, given the gleam in Lucas's eye whenever he spoke to her. When we entered Lucas's house, it was alive with music and laughter. Guests filled the spacious living room, their conversations mingling with the clink of glasses. Lucas greeted us at the door, his arm lingering a little too long around Emily's shoulder as he leaned in to compliment her dress. I told myself it was just Lucas being Lucas, gregarious and overly familiar. The night unfolded predictably at first. Drinks flowed, jokes were shared, and I found myself engaged in a heated debate about football with a couple of neighbors. Emily, meanwhile, flitted around the room, her laughter ringing out as Lucas hovered nearby. My unease grew with every passing glance they exchanged. At one point, I decided to grab another drink from the kitchen, a quieter space compared to the cacophony of the living room. As I turned the corner, I caught sight of Lucas and Emily in the dimly lit hallway. Their heads were close together, and they seemed deeply engaged in conversation. Lucas was smiling, his hand resting lightly on her arm. I cleared my throat loudly, startling them both. "Need anything from the kitchen?" I asked, keeping my tone even. "No, I'm good," Emily said, her cheeks flushed as she stepped away from Lucas. "Just talking about the wine pairing." Lucas's grin didn't falter. "Your wife has a great palate," he quipped before strolling back toward the party. The evening took a darker turn when the party transitioned to a makeshift dance floor. Lucas, acting as DJ, played sultry tracks that drew people closer together. Emily was one of the first to get up and dance, and Lucas wasn't far behind. I watched as he twirled her around, his hand lingering a little too long on her waist. My fists clenched at my sides. Feeling out of place and frustrated, I stepped out onto the patio for some fresh air. That's when I overheard two women talking near the edge of the yard. "Did you see Lucas and Emily earlier?" "They were practically inseparable," one of them said, giggling. "Yeah, but isn't that his thing? Nora's not even back yet, and he's already lining up his next conquest," the other replied. The weight of their words hit me like a freight train. Was I being paranoid, or was there more to this party than met the eye? I needed to find Emily. When I re-entered the house, the lights were dimmed, and the party had taken on a more intimate vibe. Emily wasn't on the dance floor anymore. I searched the living room, the kitchen, and even the den, but she was nowhere to be seen. My heart raced as I pushed open the door to the upstairs balcony. There they were, Emily and Lucas, standing close together under the glow of the string lights. Their conversation seemed intense, and Lucas had a hand on her lower back. I stepped forward, my voice breaking the moment. "Emily, we need to talk." She turned sharply, her expression a mix of guilt and irritation. "What's wrong?" "What's wrong is that you've been glued to Lucas all night," I shot back, my voice rising. Lucas raised his hands in mock surrender. "Hey man, no need to get worked up. We were just talking." "Talking, huh?" My eyes bore into Emily. "Let's go." The drive home was silent. Emily stared out the window, her arms crossed tightly. When we finally pulled into the driveway, she spoke, her voice defensive. "You're making a big deal out of nothing," she said. "Lucas was just being friendly." "Friendly doesn't involve secret conversations and private dances," I retorted. The argument spiraled from there, her tone swinging from defensive to dismissive. But as I lay awake that night, The question gnawed at me. Was Lucas really just friendly, or had Emily crossed a line she couldn't uncross? The party was already in full swing by the time we arrived, music thumping loud enough to rattle the windows. Lucas stood near the entrance, greeting guests with his trademark grin. As soon as he saw us, he strode over with open arms, pulling Emily into a warm hug that lingered just a moment too long. "Glad you could make it," he said, clapping me on the shoulder. His charm, while smooth, had always felt performative, but tonight it grated on me more than usual. Emily beamed at him. "Happy birthday. Everything looks amazing, Lucas." "It's not the same without you here," Lucas replied, his eyes fixed on her for a beat longer than necessary. I forced a polite chuckle and stepped aside, letting them chat while I scanned the room. The house was packed. Neighbors, colleagues, even a few people I didn't recognize mingling in the sprawling living room and spilling out onto the patio. A professionally catered buffet and an open bar added a touch of elegance, and the air buzzed with the kind of energy only Lucas seemed capable of conjuring. Emily, however, was practically glowing. Her excitement from earlier had followed her here, amplifying as she moved through the room with Lucas at her side. They laughed together, shared knowing glances, and stood just close enough that their shoulders brushed more often than not. I tried to shake off the growing pit in my stomach. I was overthinking things, surely. Lucas was just a magnetic personality, and Emily was swept up in the atmosphere. That's what I told myself as I grabbed a drink and found a corner to settle in. It didn't take long for my suspicions to creep back in. While I chatted with a few colleagues from work, my eyes kept drifting to Emily. She was by Lucas's side, leaning in close as they spoke. He said something that made her laugh, a little too loudly, and then touched her arm in a way that felt unnecessarily intimate. My drink suddenly tasted bitter. At one point, I approached her, hoping to break up whatever bond they seemed to be forming. "Having fun?" I asked, slipping an arm around her waist. She smiled, but it felt distant, like she was half listening. "Of course. Lucas was just telling me about his last trip to Italy. Can you believe he went truffle hunting?" "Sounds fascinating," I said flatly, not bothering to hide my lack of enthusiasm. Lucas smirked. "You'd love it, man. The countryside, the food, it's life-changing. Emily was saying you two should plan a trip sometime." "Maybe," I replied curtly, eager to pull her away from him. "Come on, Emily, let's grab something to eat." "Oh, you go ahead," she said, brushing me off with a wave. "I want to hear the rest of Lucas's story." I walked away, my frustration mounting. The rest of the evening followed the same pattern. Lucas and Emily seemed tethered to each other, their conversations flowing with a familiarity that made my skin crawl. Meanwhile, I felt like an outsider at my own wife's side. I mingled with other guests, but it was hard to focus with their voices carrying across the room. When the party transitioned to dancing, things took a turn for the worse. The lights dimmed, and Lucas, ever the host, took over as DJ, curating a playlist that had everyone swaying to the beat. Emily was one of the first to hit the makeshift dance floor, and Lucas joined her almost immediately. I stood off to the side, drink in hand, watching as they moved together. It wasn't overtly inappropriate, but there was an intimacy to the way they interacted, a familiarity that didn't belong. Lucas spun her around, his hand lingering on her lower back, and Emily threw her head back, laughing like she didn't have a care in the world. "Your wife looks like she's having a great time," one of the neighbors remarked, sidling up beside me. "Yeah," I replied tightly, forcing a smile. The man chuckled. "Lucas has a way of making everyone feel special. He's a charmer, that one." "Too much of one, maybe," I muttered under my breath. I couldn't take it anymore. Leaving my drink on a nearby table, I pushed through the crowd to where Emily and Lucas were dancing. "Emily," I said, raising my voice to be heard over the music, "can I have a word?" She looked at me, her expression shifting to mild annoyance. "What is it?" "We're just dancing." "We need to talk," I said firmly, gesturing toward the patio. Lucas stepped back, raising his hands in mock surrender. "Don't worry, I won't steal her away." I ignored him, guiding Emily outside where the cool night air hit us like a slap. "What's going on with you tonight?" I demanded, my voice low but sharp. "What are you talking about?" she asked, crossing her arms defensively. "Lucas." You've been glued to him all night. She rolled her eyes. Don't be ridiculous. We were just talking and dancing. It's a party. That's what people do. Not like that, I shot back. You're acting like you're trying to impress him. Her eyes narrowed. You're being paranoid. Am I? I challenged. Because it sure doesn't feel like it. She sighed, exasperated. You're reading too much into this. Lucas is our friend. That's all. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to chalk up everything to my own insecurities. But the way she avoided my gaze, the defensive edge in her tone, it didn't sit right. As the party continued inside, I stood on the patio, the laughter and music muffled through the glass door. Lucas and Emily's connection might have been innocent, but the unease twisting in my gut told me otherwise. Something was shifting between us, and I wasn't sure if we'd be able to shift it back. The argument on the patio left a sour taste in my mouth. Emily stormed back inside, shaking her head, while I lingered, letting the cool air soothe my frustration. I could hear the muffled thump of music and laughter behind the glass doors, but I had no desire to step back into the party. Watching her spend the evening attached to Lucas like a magnet was more than I could bear. After a few minutes, I made up my mind. I wasn't going to stand around like a fool while my wife acted like she was the guest of honor at Lucas's birthday. I stepped inside briefly to let her know I was leaving. I'm heading home, I said, finding her near the bar. She was laughing at something Lucas had just said. Her smile faltered for a split second. Already? It's not even that late. Yeah, well, I'm not exactly in the mood to party anymore. My tone was clipped, but I didn't care. Emily hesitated, glancing at Lucas, who was suddenly very interested in his drink. You go ahead. I'll stay for a bit longer. No need for both of us to leave early. I stared at her, incredulous. You're really staying? It's Lucas's birthday, she said, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. For a moment, I considered arguing, but I realized there was no point. Fine, I said, my voice colder than I intended. Without waiting for her response, I turned and left. The walk home was short, but each step felt heavy, weighed down by the gnawing unease that had been growing all night. By the time I reached our house, the silence was almost deafening. I kicked off my shoes and sank onto the couch, staring blankly at the darkened TV screen. An hour passed. Then another. I kept checking the clock, expecting to hear the sound of her key in the door, but the house remained quiet. Midnight came and went, and with it, my patience. Pulling out my phone, I sent her a text. Are you coming home soon? No response. I waited another 20 minutes before calling her. It rang until voicemail picked up. I tried again and again, but each call went unanswered. My irritation quickly morphed into something closer to panic. What the hell was she doing? Unable to sit still any longer, I grabbed my jacket and headed back to Lucas's house. The neighborhood was eerily quiet, the glow from Lucas's windows the only sign of life. As I approached, I could hear faint music still playing, though the earlier cacophony of laughter and chatter had died down. Peering through the front windows, I could see a few stragglers still milling about, glasses in hand, their conversations subdued. Emily wasn't among them. I circled the side of the house, my heart pounding in my chest. The backyard was empty now, the patio lights casting long shadows over the neatly trimmed grass. My gaze drifted upward to the second floor, where a soft light glowed from one of the windows. Lucas's bedroom. My stomach churned as I stepped closer, careful to stay out of sight. From my vantage point, I could see into the room. Lucas was there, sitting on the edge of the bed. Emily stood in front of him, her back to me. Her posture was stiff, her arms crossed tightly across her chest. Lucas said something I couldn't hear, his expression calm, almost soothing. Then he reached out, placing a hand gently on her arm. She didn't pull away. I felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. For a moment, I couldn't move, couldn't think. My worst fears were unfolding before my eyes, and I was powerless to stop it. I clenched my fists, my nails digging into my palms as I forced myself to keep watching. Lucas stood, his hands sliding down Emily's arm until their fingers intertwined. She said something then, her voice muffled through the glass, and he stepped closer. I wanted to burst into the room, to drag her out of there, but something kept me rooted in place. Maybe it was fear of what I might see, fear of confirmation that my suspicions were right all along. Lucas leaned in, his face inches from hers. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. Then Emily turned her head, stepping back slightly, her hand pulling free from his grasp. Relief flooded me, but it was short-lived. Lucas closed the distance between them again, his hand now resting on her waist. She didn't push him away, but she didn't reciprocate either. The tension between them was palpable, and I felt like I was suffocating just watching it. I couldn't take it anymore. Turning away, I stumbled back toward the street, my chest heaving with a mix of rage, betrayal, and helplessness. When I reached the sidewalk, I stopped, debating whether to confront her now or wait until she came home. But as I stood there, the realization hit me like a sledgehammer. This wasn't just about what I'd seen tonight. It was about everything. The way she'd acted around Lucas, the way she'd dismissed my concerns, the way she'd stayed behind without a second thought. I didn't know if she'd crossed a line tonight, but I knew we were teetering on the edge of something that could shatter us completely. The walk home felt like a blur. When I finally stumbled through the door, I collapsed onto the couch, staring blankly into the darkness. Emily still wasn't home, and I wasn't sure I wanted her to be. The night Emily didn't come home shattered something fundamental in me. When she finally walked through the door just after sunrise, she looked exhausted but calm, as though nothing had happened. I was sitting on the couch, my mind racing and my heart heavy. She barely acknowledged me before heading straight to the shower. I didn't confront her right away. I couldn't. I needed clarity, something solid, because no matter how much my gut screamed at me, I wasn't ready to accuse her without proof. I sat there, motionless, my mind forming a plan. For the next few days, I observed her closely. Emily went about her usual routine, but something was different. She was on her phone more often, texting with an intensity that was unlike her. She kept her phone close, closer than usual. Every time I walked into the room, she'd angle it away or lock the screen quickly. It wasn't just the phone. She seemed distant. Her laughter felt forced, her conversations with me surface level at best. When I tried to engage her, she brushed me off with vague excuses about being tired or preoccupied with work. One evening, as she showered, I finally decided to look at her phone. She'd left it charging on the kitchen counter, a rare lapse in her newfound vigilance. My hands trembled as I unlocked it, using the passcode I'd known for years. At first, everything looked normal. There were the usual text threads with friends and family, harmless and mundane. But when I scrolled down, I found a contact saved under the name Lisa. It caught my attention because Emily didn't have a close friend by that name. The messages were buried beneath layers of ordinary chats, as though they'd been deliberately hidden. But when I opened the thread, my heart sank. The messages weren't from Elisa, they were from Lucas. Their conversations stretched back weeks, months even. They joked, flirted, and reminisced about that night without ever specifying what had happened. I scrolled faster, desperate to piece it together. Can't stop thinking about last Friday. You looked stunning. Lucas had written, accompanied by a winking emoji. Emily's response was quick. You always know how to make me blush. Let's not talk about it here. My stomach churned as I kept reading. The messages were peppered with moments of hesitation from Emily, half-hearted attempts to draw a boundary, but Lucas always managed to pull her back in. You're impossible, she had written at one point. And you love it, Lucas replied. There were photos too, though thankfully nothing explicit. A selfie of Lucas grinning at the camera, a glass of wine in his hand. A picture Emily had sent of herself, dressed up, captioned, "Can't wait for tonight." I felt like I was going to be sick. By the time Emily stepped out of the shower, I'd put her phone back exactly where I found it, but my mind was spinning. She acted as though everything was normal, chatting idly about dinner plans as she dried her hair. I nodded along, the words barely registering. I needed more than just texts. I needed undeniable proof, something that wouldn't allow her to wriggle free with excuses or explanations. Over the next week, I started digging deeper. I checked her laptop when she wasn't around, sifting through emails and browser history. Most of it was clean, but there were gaps, periods of time where her history had clearly been wiped. It only deepened my suspicions. One evening, when she left her handbag in the living room, I rifled through it, my heart pounding in my chest. In an inner pocket, I found a receipt for a boutique hotel. The date matched the night of Lucas's party. I stared at it, my hands shaking. Room 203. Paid in cash. This was no coincidence. My next move was risky, but I couldn't stop myself. I installed a monitoring app on her phone, something I'd never imagined doing in a million years. It made me feel sick, violating her privacy like this, but the truth had become an obsession. The app allowed me to see her messages in real time. Over the following days, I watched their interactions unfold. "I miss you," Lucas wrote one morning. "We can't keep doing this," Emily replied. But moments later, she sent another message. "When can we talk?" The betrayal seeped through every word, every exchange. They were careful not to say too much, but the undertones were clear. This wasn't a one-time mistake, it was an ongoing affair. The final nail came late one night. Emily was asleep beside me, her breathing soft and even, while I stared at my phone in the dark. Lucas sent her a message. "I need to see you." "Tomorrow night?" Emily's reply came minutes later. "I'll think of an excuse." The rage that coursed through me was unlike anything I'd ever felt. My worst fears weren't just confirmed, they were amplified, made worse by the months of lies and deceit I had uncovered. I got up, pacing the living room, unable to calm the storm inside me. Every detail I'd gathered played over and over in my mind like a cruel loop. The texts, the hotel receipt, the way she looked at him during the party. But even through my anger, a question gnawed at me. Why? Why had she done this? Was it something I'd done, or not done? Or was this just who she'd become? I knew I couldn't confront her yet, not while I was this furious. I needed to think, to decide what I wanted, and what I was willing to lose in the process. By the time the first rays of dawn crept through the curtains, I still hadn't slept. Emily stirred in the bedroom, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing just outside the door. But one thing was clear. This facade couldn't last much longer. The invitation to the neighborhood barbecue arrived just a few days after I'd uncovered the full extent of Emily and Lucas's betrayal. At first, I wasn't sure I could stomach going. Being around them, pretending everything was normal, it felt impossible. But the more I thought about it, the more the idea of confrontation appealed to me. Lucas's smug charm, Emily's dismissive smiles. It all deserved to be dragged into the open. When the day arrived, I dressed simply, jeans, a shirt, and a jacket. Emily was in a light summer dress, her hair tied back in a way that used to make my heart skip. Now it only filled me with resentment. "Ready?" she asked, grabbing the bottle of wine we were bringing as a contribution. I nodded, barely able to meet her eyes. The barbecue was in full swing when we arrived. The smell of grilled meat filled the air, mingling with the laughter and chatter of neighbors scattered across the backyard. Lucas was at the grill, flipping burgers with his usual air of casual confidence. His grin widened when he spotted us. "Hey, you two," he called out, waving a spatula. "Glad you could make it?" Emily smiled back, her excitement as bright as ever. She walked ahead of me, her steps light and eager. I trailed behind, my hands clenched into fists at my sides. Lucas greeted her first, of course, leaning in for a hug that lingered just long enough to make my blood boil. When he turned to me, his smile faltered slightly, sensing something in my expression. "Good to see you, man," he said, extending his hand. I shook it briefly, the contact making my skin crawl. "You too." The next hour was excruciating. Emily and Lucas gravitated toward each other like magnets, chatting and laughing as if nothing in the world could touch them. I floated through the gathering like a ghost, exchanging pleasantries with neighbors and nursing a beer I barely tasted. Every time I looked at them, my resolve hardened. By the time the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the yard, I knew it was time. The guests were gathered around the grill, plates in hand, as Lucas handed out burgers and hot dogs with his usual flair. Emily stood nearby, laughing at something he'd said. I stepped forward, my voice cutting through the hum of conversation. "Lucas, can I have a word?" He turned, his grin faltering again. Sure thing. What's up? Here's good, I said, loud enough for everyone to hear. No need to go anywhere. The crowd quieted, heads turning toward us. Emily's smile faded, confusion flickering across her face. What's going on? She asked, her tone uneasy. I ignored her, my eyes locked on Lucas. How long has it been going on? Lucas's expression froze. I'm not sure what you mean, man. Yes, you do, I said sharply. You and Emily. How long? A murmur rippled through the crowd. Emily's face went pale. This is ridiculous, she said, her voice shaking. You're making a scene. Am I? I shot back, turning to her. Because I've got months of messages that say otherwise. Hotel receipts. Late-night texts. You've been lying to me, Emily. Both of you. Her mouth opened, then closed, as if she couldn't decide whether to deny it or plead for forgiveness. Lucas, meanwhile, looked like he wanted to disappear into the ground. Listen, let's not do this here, Lucas said, his voice low, his usual confidence nowhere to be found. Why not? I demanded, my voice rising. You didn't mind parading around in front of me, did you? You didn't mind acting like nothing was going on while you laughed behind my back? The guests stood frozen, their plates forgotten. Whispers spread like wildfire through the crowd. Please, Emily said, tears welling in her eyes. Let's just go home and talk about this. No, I said firmly. We're not sweeping this under the rug. Not this time. I turned back to Lucas, who was staring at the ground, his jaw clenched. You're a coward, I said, my voice cold. You couldn't keep your hands off my wife, but you don't even have the guts to admit it now. Lucas finally looked up, his face a mix of anger and shame. Look, I'm sorry, okay? It wasn't supposed to. Save it, I snapped. I don't need your excuses. Emily broke then, her voice trembling as she spoke. It didn't mean anything, she said, her words tumbling over each other. I didn't know how to stop it. You were what? I interrupted. Bored? Lonely? Don't pretend this was an accident, Emily. You made a choice. Both of you did. Tears streamed down her face now, but I felt no sympathy. The weight of months of betrayal, of every lie and half-truth, crushed any softness I might have felt for her. The silence that followed was suffocating. The neighbors stared, their faces a mix of shock and discomfort. No one knew where to look, what to say. Finally, I turned and walked away. I didn't look back as I left the yard, the hum of whispered conversations following me. Back home, the silence was deafening. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the floor. Emily hadn't come after me, and I wasn't sure I wanted her to. For the first time in weeks, I felt something close to relief. The truth was out. There was no more pretending, no more lies. But the weight of what came next loomed large, and I wasn't sure if I was ready to face it. I sat at the dining table, the house eerily quiet, replaying the scene from the barbecue in my mind. The shock on Lucas's face, the tears in Emily's eyes, the hushed murmurs of the neighbors, it all felt surreal, like I had been watching someone else's life implode. But it wasn't someone else's life. It was mine. Emily came home late that night, long after the sun had set and the streets were deserted. I heard the door open and close softly, followed by her hesitant footsteps in the hallway. She paused in the doorway to the living room, her silhouette trembling. Can we talk? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't look up. Go ahead. She moved cautiously into the room and sat on the couch, clutching a tissue in her hand. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The tension in the air was unbearable. I'm sorry, she said finally, her voice breaking. I know that doesn't fix anything, but I need you to know how sorry I am. I let out a bitter laugh. Sorry doesn't even begin to cover it, Emily. She flinched as if I'd struck her. I know I messed up. No, I destroyed everything. But please, let me explain. I folded my arms, leaning back in my chair. I'd love to hear how you're going to explain months of lying, sneaking around, and God knows what else. Her face crumpled, and tears spilled down her cheeks. It wasn't like that, she insisted. I didn't plan for any of this to happen. It got out of control. That's not an explanation, I said sharply. That's an excuse. She wiped her eyes, her breathing uneven. I've been so lonely, so disconnected from you. You've been distant for months, maybe longer. And then Lucas, he made me feel seen, like I mattered. I know that doesn't make what I did okay, but it's the truth. Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. Lonely? I repeated. So you decided the solution was to betray me with the neighbor? To humiliate me in front of everyone? I didn't mean for it to go this far, she said, her voice cracking. It started with innocent conversations, and before I knew it, I didn't know how to stop. I didn't want to hurt you. Didn't want to hurt me? I said, my voice rising. You didn't think about me at all, Emily. Every message, every meeting, every time you chose him over me, you thought about yourself, not about us. She buried her face in her hands, sobbing quietly. I wanted to feel something, anger, sadness, maybe even pity, but all I felt was numb. I stared at her, the woman I had built a life with, and I couldn't recognize her anymore. I want to fix this, she said finally, her words muffled by her tears. I'll do whatever it takes. Therapy, counseling, anything. I love you. I shook my head slowly. If you loved me, you wouldn't have done this. I do love you, she insisted, looking up at me with desperate eyes. I made a horrible mistake, but that doesn't mean I don't love you. Please, we can get through this. I stood, unable to sit still any longer. You don't just accidentally fall into someone else's arms, Emily. This wasn't a mistake, it was a choice. Over and over again, you chose him. She got up too, reaching for my arm, but I stepped back. I was stupid, she said, her voice trembling. I let my feelings cloud my judgment. I let him manipulate me. Don't put this all on him, I snapped. He didn't force you to do anything. You were a willing participant. Her shoulders sagged, and she sank back onto the couch, her sobs filling the room. I can't lose you, she whispered. Please don't give up on us. I stared at her, my mind a storm of conflicting emotions. Part of me wanted to believe her, to cling to the hope that we could rebuild what was broken. But the other part, the louder, angrier part, couldn't get past the images in my head, her texts with Lucas, their closeness at the party, the hotel receipt I'd found. I don't know if there's anything left to save, I said finally, my voice hollow. Her head snapped up, panic flashing in her eyes. Don't say that. We've been through so much together. We can get through this too. This is different, I said. You didn't just hurt me, you destroyed the trust we built over years. How am I supposed to look at you and not see him? How am I supposed to believe a word you say? I'll prove it to you, she said, her words tumbling out in a rush. I'll cut him out of my life completely. I'll show you that you can trust me again. I wanted to believe her, but the thought of her promises felt like salt in an open wound. And what about next time? I asked. What happens the next time you feel lonely? Or unappreciated? Do you find someone else to make you feel seen? She shook her head vehemently. There won't be a next time. I swear. Her pleas hung in the air, but they couldn't reach me. I turned away, pacing the room as I tried to process everything. My mind screamed at me to leave, to end it now before the pain could deepen. But my heart wasn't so sure. I need time, I said finally, my voice tight. I can't make any decisions right now. Her face crumpled further, but she nodded. Take all the time you need, she said softly. Just don't shut me out completely. I didn't answer. Instead, I walked out of the room, leaving her alone with her tears. The silence that followed was deafening, and I couldn't tell if it felt like freedom or the weight of everything I had just lost.